Let's see what the sign says. Okay. All right. So here we are. Okay. Okay. Let's check them. Wait. Good afternoon and welcome to We Keep It Moving with Marcia Jews. And I am here with my guest, Marcia Chatelain. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
Oh, I am excited that we're here and that we're able to have this conversation. And let me just introduce my guest. I'm so excited to have you here, Marcia. She is a professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown University, the author of South Side Girls Growing Up in the Great Migration, Duke University Press 2015. She teaches about women's and girls' history as well as Black capitalism. Her latest book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, Liverite Publishing, examines the intricate relationship among African American politicians, civil rights organizations, communities, and the fast food industry. In 2021, Chatelain received the Pulitzer Prize in History, the Hagley Prize in Business History, and the Organization of American Historians, OAH, Lawrence W. Levine Award for Franchise. An active public speaker and educational consultant, Chatelain has received awards and honors from the Ford Foundation, the American Association of University Women, and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. At Georgetown, she has won several teaching awards. In 2016, the Chronicle of Higher Ed named her a top influencer in academia in recognition of her social media campaign, hashtag Ferguson syllabus, which implored educators to facilitate discussions about the crisis in Ferguson and Missouri in 2014. She has held an Eric and Wendy Schmidt Fellowship at New America, a National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Fellowship, and an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. Girl, you have been busy. And let me say this right here, that bio speaks volumes about who you are and the commitment that you've made to not only your education, but to the world, and being able to give this information and do it stellarly. Is that a word? Since you're a professor, but I love it. And I'm very excited to have you here. And I think one of the things that's very interesting is how we got here as a people, right? Here we are in looking at the former um, democracy program that we had on PBS, pursuing a more perfect union, preserving our democracy. I watched that intently, and it was very interesting and disturbing at the same time. Please, and you were there as part of the representatives of subject matter experts. You were there talking about, as you saw it, how we see government, how we see our democracy, and where our democracy is headed based on the historical context to the insurrection January 6, 2021. Would you care to just give us an overview about that?
Yeah, so preserving democracy toward a more perfect union is trying to capture the complex nature of democracy as a concept, as well as the history of how it's been lived in the United States. And so we go into the origins of the idea of a democratic state, from France to the U.S. to the American Revolution through the Civil Rights struggle up to the day of January 6th, where we saw that the United States Capitol was breached, and we saw incredible acts of violence and threats against lawmakers for certifying the election. And I think that all of the voices on the program are trying to help audiences understand the complexity of the idea of living in a democratic society of one person, one vote, that every person has rights in front of the common document of the US Constitution, and the moments in which that just has not been true, right? When that has not been, the experience of all people in the United States. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity to think about the various influences and forces that have shaped the nation's history, as well as the current crisis of whether or not the democracy that people imagine is part of the United States, if it has actually ever been the case, and if it has been, why it's so fragile today.
I think the thing, and it is fragile. It's when I saw the insurrection occur, my heart hurt. My heart hurt. And it said to me that this is the beginning that we have seen slowly but surely etch its way into our political landscape. How do we even begin to abate this problem where we are right now? It has already occurred. The voices are still loud. What is a democracy supposed to do in an environment like that? Because we're so vehemently opposed to one another.
Well, I mean, I think that this is the challenge. How do we respect the individual rights of people, but understand that we do not exist as individuals within the society? I think that one of the great lessons of um, our nation is that freedom is not license. That the freedoms that we enjoy are contingent upon our ability to respect and uplift the freedom of other people. And I think that throughout the film, we really talk about the idea of building community, sharing perspectives that are different, but don't necessarily divide. But I think that, all of the things that led to the insurrection show us that we have to draw lines, right? Like the freedom of speech is not about the freedom to harm or to evade accountability or to attack. The freedom of speech is about an expression of what is real. And so when we have a political climate that is so shaped by lies, when there's an exacerbation of those lies through media channels and outlets, we see why it's so important for us to take a step back and say, what exactly are we trying to preserve? And what are we trying to realize for the first time?
Mm-hmm. So, and so I think one of the things that, excuse me, really sets a tone is that one voice can lead many. One voice can lead many. And if that one voice has the ability to change the tide of our political landscape, what is the responsibility of whatever current administration is in place to change that? How can you change it? Because the voices are getting louder.
Mm-hmm.
They've not disappeared. We can go back in history and we can see how anarchy takes over countries. How do you deal with that? And what is an administration to do to combat that when you have a nation or a percentage of the nation that is fixated on a different kind of country?
Well, I think the big question is, how seriously do we take this? There were so many people who found Donald Trump's antics funny. They thought, oh, this is going to be great for ratings. This is going to be great for laughs. And we don't take our degradation lightly. We don't take our insults lightly. And so for people who have been on the receiving end of that kind of racist, animus, we didn't find anything amusing about that because we knew the power of that. As much as Trump was a buffoon, he was a very influential buffoon. And we've known that there have been a number of people who've been, exaggerated in their language and, caricatures and buffoons, but we understood the power that they had. And so I think that, part of what this moment is about isn't just reflecting on what happened on January 6th, but all of the things that led up to that moment, the galvanization of people who had so much grievance, the galvanization of Trump's base, the complicity of the media, the complicity of the social media channels, like all of these people, I hope, took a pause on January 6th and said, you know what, I played a part in this. And so what am I going to do to undo this?
But can it be undone?
I think I think it can be undone. Excuse me. I'm a college professor. I see the power of education, not just the students I teach in my class, but the ways that information that I teach them, how it trickles out into their community, right? When a student learns something new or comes to a greater understanding, they share that with other people. And I've had many times over a holiday break where a student will say, "Can you email me that article that we talked about in class? I'm going to talk to my parents about this, or I'm going to talk to my grandparents about this." So, I think it's possible, but I think it's impossible if we don't have some type of reckoning or accountability. On January 6th, there were a number of people who should have addressed the nation and said, "I'm really sorry. I contributed to this. I should have never done this." If the Republican Party were a serious party, they would all come together on a public platform and said, "You know what, American people, I ask for your forgiveness for the damage we have done as an organized body and as individuals. We ask your forgiveness." And you know what's so funny? I think that would actually make a big difference. It wouldn't solve every problem, but I think just the acknowledgement that harm was done. This is how hate mongers and fear leaders and dictators. This is how they operate. They don't acknowledge reality. They don't acknowledge any kind of harm. Everything's fine. I've done the best. I've always loved you. And that, I think, is what is most harmful to the national consciousness.
So when we look at that harm and the impact of that harm, it's also impacting people of color, right? In a very profound manner, right? Because we've seen similarities before, right? How how does an entire population of this country move forward in in an electorate that has been so divisive? How do we manage that where uh, voting areas have been locked out and that whole equity issue is brought under question? How do we move forward in that environment?
I think we have to remember, what is possible. We are in the midst of, I think, one of the most existentially challenging periods in human history, where we have seen mass death and much of it preventable because of COVID-19.
Mhm.
We've seen incredible rise of extremism, and we've also seen the wonders as well as the perils of technology. So I think we're at this incredible nexus. And what's been really fascinating to see is how many people are turning within. They're turning to their families and communities for strength. We've had these networks of mutual aid that have been coming in and taking care of people during COVID. We have people who are, kind of pushing back against technology running their lives. We have people who are standing up against extremism. And so I think the way that we get out of it is for those of us who have platforms, is really amplify the people who are fighting, to say that giving up is not inevitable, that these are the people who will continue to fight for what we believe in, what is right, and we're going to lift them up. Because I think for every story that can give us a sense of doom, we have a lived experience of hope. And I think that this is how we combat these two forces back and forth. But I think that we've also come to a greater consciousness about what it means to live in a civil society. Remember before, when no one knew what a superdelegate was, and then we learned real fast, and then we didn't really understand the impact of voter ID, and then we understood, right? So like, we are growing in our consciousness as these forces against democracy. They're strategizing, but there's also a counter strategy, right? Like, people are pushing back against that. And so I just hope that the moments of triumph are being shared and are understood as vital to our survival.
But don't we also have to concern ourselves with not only the whole democratic process, right? But when we go on Capitol Hill and we see that there's such divisiveness on the floor, where people who are making laws, and we look at who is in our Supreme Courts, how do we manage that? So, how do we guarantee what we're seeing, and how do we, because there's so much fear. The insurrection frightened me. I
It's
mean,
very frightening.
really, it's like, are you serious? Where do I go? What do I do with my family? Do I really want to be in this country? This is not the America that I thought I was comfortable in.
Yeah.
What do we do with that?
I think we express it. I think we share that, and I think we remind ourselves of the powers that we do have. I mean, a large part of this documentary is about the politics of backlash, and
Mhm.
every moment of progress is followed by regressive action, followed by people who are trying to push back. And I think a sophisticated understanding of history allows us to say, okay, we are in the backlash right now. What were the strategies that previous generations did to survive the backlash and come back stronger? None of these things are easy to do. They're terrifying, and hopelessness doesn't move us in any direction. But I think fully acknowledging just how upsetting and traumatic and eviscerating it was to watch January 6th unfold. I think that we have yet to fully account for the
Mhm.
impact of that day.
And so, one of the things that I thought was very interesting in this documentary was the review of several countries who had started down one path, India and Pakistan and several others, right? They started Germany and France, and they had started down this path. And then all of a sudden, they were met with all of uh, this block. It's that changed the tide of their country,
Mhm.
right? It took time to kind of get it back, say if you go down the wrong path, make a right turn, right? But how do you do that in an environment where we have not really seen that type of activity? We've only been looking at it from afar. How, but you have such a movement of people who are galvanizing masses of people in this country to change how our leadership and what happens in our government. What do we do? How do you abate that?
I think that's so difficult because I think the act of running for office seems so terrible because you see the low common denominator in the insults, you see the attacks, and we still need people to contribute to public service. And that's what's so hard. And so I think that, service at the local level, service within communities gives people the strength and the confidence to fight those bigger fights. Because I think that, we talk a lot about the public service crisis and why young people don't want to work for government and why people don't want to run for office. And it's because of this toxic culture. And so it's surrounding very strong people to run for office and building a community around them to keep them committed and to keep them, sheltered from some of the attacks. It's been amazing to see the young women of color who have been serving in Congress who are not backing down, who are targets, who were very afraid for their life on January 6th. But what they've done is they've built a community of support around them to allow them to continue in that work. And I think that that's the type of thing that we need to look at. It's not just our candidate winning;
Mhm.
it's about our candidate being supported and cared for.
But you made a very good point. And when you talk about those incredible women of color that are in there and having uh, a support system around them, but what are four things that we should be looking at? Well, you've got 50 states. Everybody has a representative in the Congress and in the Senate. What should we be doing as we look forward to making certain that there are people who believe in the ideals of this country? Or are those ideals even relevant anymore?
Well, they're definitely relevant because what they provide isn't a code of conduct, but rather an agreement on values, and they help set the parameters and boundaries for action. If you believe in certain values, there are certain things you will not do. There were certain things you just won't do. I think it's making sure that those values are clear and also demanding accountability. I think the engagement has to be relentless to make sure that people understand that, certain things will not be tolerated. That we do not accept lies. We do not accept scapegoating. We don't accept racism and sexism as part of our politics. It's that relentlessness. And I think we do it when we are able to come together in community. So it's not just one person saying, you didn't do this, you didn't do this, but we come together and say, what are the things that we need to do to make sure that the values we have are actually being put into place and they are actually working. And this requires all of us together, and I think we have to bring more and more people to the table to do that.
And so I'm going to counter that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm looking at the numbers of people who are in leadership roles nationally and organizations that were already in place and have been in place for years, decades. And now looking at what do we do with all of these entities that are committed to overturning the government as we know it. That's a large issue. And is there a government? Is there an entity? How do you even prevent that type of movement? I mean, and it's a movement. It's like you've got all these people pushing 2,000 Mack trucks and tanks down the street, and they're prepared to do that or blow those tanks up. What do we do about that? How do we do anything about that?
I think we take it. I think that we learn that you don't let anything go by. I think that we take it all seriously. It's not just chatter. It's just not idle talk. But I think that the interventions start early, right? When I'm on the road kind of doing teacher trainings, I've had a teacher say to me, there's a student in my class who seems really fascinated with Nazis and all of this extremist stuff. I said, you take that seriously. I said, this is a 9th grader. I said, wow. You intervene, you tell someone and you say, I'm a little concerned about the things that you're getting into. Can you tell me why you like this? Why are you fascinated? What are the things, you meet it where it's at? Because I think what tends to happen is that, we're in such a non-confrontational culture, right? No one says anything. Everyone sees things are happening. No one steps in. And I think we have to learn how to step in for these types of extremist thoughts, and don't let it get sorted out somewhere else, saying, what am I observing and what are the ways that I can interrupt this? Because the thing about the people who are galvanized for January 6th, a lot of the seeds of that was the everyday racism, the casual racism, the reification or the validation of white supremacy in their lives. There could have been a process that could have stopped that. It starts early. It's with the honest teaching of history. It's being very clear about violence and its implications. There's a lot of ways to stop that. The question is whether or not we're ready for a societal shift, a transformation that would allow that to happen.
Mm-hmm. So there are two things here that to respond to that really give me pause. How do we inculcate that kind of concept in a broad educational system, from an elementary, middle, and high school and college? How do we deploy curriculum that literally speaks to what that experience was, and how that might be your next book, and how how that can be put within the system of our government, right, on a local, state, and federal level? How do you teach that now? All of those books are missing these huge parts of the impact that this is having on on the world, literally our behavior here, where people in other nations were comfortable with us. How do we send that down to our young people for them to understand what they saw, what they heard, what they should be thinking, and how they can be a participant?
Well, I mean, I think that, we are in the middle of a culture war about the honest teaching of history. And for people who believe that this is wrong, they have to stand up for their teachers. They have to stand up for the types of, teaching that's necessary to make a difference. And they also have to support the institutions that create and preserve history. When people say, oh, this stuff is so important for us to learn, I said, okay, put a few dollars to your local library, put a few dollars for your local archive. Don't be upset when your kids major in history in college. Like, you have to support active learning everywhere you can, because the forces that want to stop it, it's not that they're expert organizers, but they know how to show up for their agenda. And we have to also create an agenda, a powerful one, to say, this is how we are looking at the world, and this is why we think this is important.
This is how we're looking at the world. I don't even know what I'm looking at anymore.
Listen.
Right? I don't even know what I'm looking at anymore. And so and I've been through a lot, right? I've seen a lot. You can tell by all these gray hairs. But what's my expectation for my 13-year-old grandson? And right?
Mm-hmm.
You were going to say something. Go ahead.
No, I think this is what's been so interesting about this moment, is just how much people have used intergenerational learning and knowledge as a place of growth. After Trump was elected, my students were, including me, we were like, what just happened here? We were really shook. And what I thought was really interesting was the number of students who said, I talked to my parents a little bit about this, but my grandparents really were able to share the kind of rage I was feeling, or the hopelessness I was feeling. And they were telling me what it was like, to live through the civil rights movement. And, there was a way that this generation is experiencing things that put them with, that they have more in common with their great great grandparents than even their parents, because they're living through a global pandemic. They are having more in common with generations that have seen the complete upending of the American presidency. They are having more in common with grandparents who fought, who were on the streets marching for racial justice, and now they are too. And so this is an incredible time for our youth to learn from so many generations past and really appreciate and understand their struggles, because some of them are so similar. And I think that this will be something for generations to come that we study, and we say, it's interesting, the COVID generation and the great influenza generation, what did they have in common?
Mm-hmm. I'm curious, there's been sort of a gap between Congress and Senate, and who's attending, who's not. But when I talk about these young people who have this expectation of their lives in the next 10 years, what happens when our legislative body, our government, is so divided? What is it going to take for these lessons to be put behind us and a new strategy put together by the leadership of this nation? How do we bring that together and still maintain our democracy?
I think what it will need, what will require, is a lot of moral courage on the part of our elected officials. I think it requires a change in tone. I think that in some ways President Biden has squandered a lot of opportunities thus far to do that. But I think that, the divisiveness in Congress, I think that will have a breaking point, because what COVID has done, the weight of COVID was being borne by people who are the most disenfranchised, the poorest people, people of color, people, who were very much marginalized. But now it can't be contained in one group. It's everyone is being so affected by it, so whether you want it or not, whether you're going to get your groceries is going to be affected. What your shipping is affected, your kids' school. And so I think that the more and more everyone is feeling this impact, and even when we get out of it, I think that is the place where someone says, look, we have all been through this. And so you can't claim your own piece of the world separate from other people. We have to live together. We have to think together. We have to make decisions together. And so I think for the very talented and committed and conscientious, I think they will rise to the occasion because we will need it so desperately.
Yeah, and it is desperate, and that's one of the things that concerns me, that do we really want to have a civil, racial, or political war? Does this is this nation ready for that type of movement? The country has seen an outrageous number of military issue type guns and semi-auto, army military kind of equipment is being purchased across this country, as though people are arming themselves for Armageddon or something. What do we do about that? How does a government manage a citizenry that is behaving as though they want another, not even an insurrection, an actual coup of our government?
You know,
What do
I
we
think
do with that?
I think I think that the glorification of violence, and I think the circulations of guns and weapons is the fundamental problem. I don't know if I know what we do, but I do think that there has to be pressure to hold accountable. There has to be consequences for this, and I think that for so long there haven't been. And so whether you are a person who kind of believes that the justice system can do this or not, we have to think about like what then have to be the implications for someone's life who makes these decisions, and we have to pursue that.
And so I'm going to ask you, because you used a word that was really powerful. Where do we apply that pressure? Right? Where is a consensus for that pressure to be realized?
Um, you know, um, I think we put the pressure on every entity that is contingent, um, you know, contingent on these types of divides to grow financially or with their power. So we put the pressure on our politicians, we put the pressure on the corporations, we put the pressure on the employers, we put the pressure on schools, every place, right, that fails to take seriously the implications of this, we show up at those places. We deploy our forces into all of these places and say, yeah, no, we're not going to tolerate this. I mean, I think we're headed there with all of this confusion about COVID. Workers shouldn't show up to work. We need a day where no one's showing up to work to say, like, this is not okay. We will not tolerate this. For all the striking workers who have been striking, this past fall and into the winter, many of them have won their demands. They said, we're not doing this. We can't do business as usual. And I think we have to take that mindset, everywhere we go.
Mhm. So, in from your seat as an educator, would you have even imagined something like this occurring in the United States?
I one of the things that growing up in the U.S. they tell you is that the thing that makes this so special is that we always can have a peaceful transfer of power, and I think that's always such an interesting framing because we may not see violence on election day, but there has been a lot of violence in the nation's history, and there's a lot of violence today. I do think that January 6th reminds us not to take for granted what we call the peaceful transfer of power, and to think about the different places where violence is embedded in our society, that we may not see it all the time, but that it's there. And so I have to say, I was very shocked by what I saw because for so long, people have wrapped themselves around the flag and said how much they love America and all this kind of stuff. And those are the same groups of people who are willing to destroy and kill at will.
Mhm. So this is going to be, I don't know, but do you think that the fact that uh, Barack Obama became the president of the United States was like the period at the end of the sentence or an exclamation point?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that the roots of this is the election of President Obama um, and the white resentment and the real, white supremacist organizing and it being legitimated and validated by so many members of the Republican Party that absolutely that was the match.
Hmm. And since it was lit, right? How do we move forward, because all that trickles down to all of the other people that have melanin,
Yeah.
right? I'm going to keep going back to this because the leadership in our law enforcement departments have to take a stance, and it's to, the pledge, that what they raised their hand and said what all they would do as a citizen and as a representative of our law enforcement bodies that aren't adhering to what they raise their hand to.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are no federal standards um, of for law enforcement, so it's county by county, district by district. But there's also such a synergy between white supremacist groups, military, and police,
Mm.
and there's no kind of will to say, okay, this is unacceptable if you are going to be, entrusted with the public safety, then you can't be part of these organizations or you can't have this type of thinking. In fact, it seems like if you have this type of thinking, this is where you are wanted. This is where you are safe. And so I think until we take very seriously the connections among that three, then we will find ourselves in similar positions.
Mhm. If you think that looking at all of, and I'm gonna go back to this because I don't know, I think that I was I was in shock. I think I cried tears that I didn't even know that I had in watching that insurrection, right? And when I look at what people are facing in the next upcoming election, what are we supposed to be doing as citizens of this country to make certain that we can get to the polls, that all these unnecessary um, hurdles are being removed across this is across the country. How do we do that?
Well, I think that we model a lot of our actions around the local groups that have been really effective. Of understanding voter registration drives now aren't just signing up people to vote. It's making sure they have a ride, making sure they have the ID, making sure their votes get counted, making sure that there's a body of electors that are operating ethically. I think that at every turn, the requirements are higher, right? Like what we need
Hmm.
to do gets more complicated, but people continue to do it, and they do it wholeheartedly, and they do it with such conviction and with passion, but understanding that, everyone has a role to play. And as complicated as it gets, if we think about that in terms of what part am I going to play? What's
Hmm.
my small part? What's my contribution? But everyone has to think in that way in order for things to actually happen.
So, from an educator's standpoint, and you're having to talk to folks about this, and I'd really like four things that you think that we should be considering when the next election comes up for our local, state, and national representatives. What should our voters be looking for when we find people to be in those positions? What is it about that person?
What is their ability to be confronted with with criticism, can they stand the heat? And not attacks, but real challenges, like, have you done this? How are we doing this? Like, if they are able to do it, this is a good sign. Their ability to, uh, make their tent larger, not smaller. You don't want to, you don't want to elect people who are just constantly talking about how everyone has to be on the outside and that you join them on the inside. I think that we need to elect people who have an understanding of a range of human experiences, not just their own. And then I think we have to elect people who have enough respect for voters and the Democratic Party and the Democratic process, rather, where they aren't sore losers. All of those things, I think, the emotional maturity and the commitment and the lack of ego necessary to lead other people, to enjoy the privilege of leading other people.
Based on what we see now, what needs to be in place to prevent that insurrection from happening again?
Robust anti-racist action.
Anti-racist action.
You
What's
enter,
anti-racist? Wait a minute. What's
you know,
anti-racist action?
um, honest conversations about the history of this nation, attempts to equalize, the position of all people, especially the racial wealth gap, a robust social safety net. We need more programs so that people can survive, to reduce desperation so that people have the time and energy to be part of civil society, a serious approach to extremism, a reimagination of what law enforcement does, resources for mental health, as well as, regulations and real standards for the circulation of information or disinformation on social media.
That's a lot.
Well, I mean,
how does that get deployed? Yeah, how does that get deployed?
Well, I think we have to have reasonable people being the voice of, those of us who want to see real change. We need to have people in public office and positions of leadership that are actually, with us. And I think that, we have to understand that you can't, you can't pay your way, you can't maneuver your way out of responsibility, for living in a collective society. And so I think that all of these things are possible, but we need to be able to protect and, promote the leadership that can bring that about.
That's huge. That's huge. And I think necessary. Those are good outlines. In looking at preserving democracy, pursuing a more perfect union, what are 3 things that you think should have been added to that documentary?
Oh, wow. It covers so much. I think it would have been important, to discuss, maybe the history of misinformation, the history of lying as part of a political strategy. I think that, I think it would have been nice to see, the ways that the George Floyd summer of 2020 did provide a lot of hope and context to people who hadn't previously been participants in activism, and the importance of protest as part of, living in a democracy. And I think that, I think that we have to keep in mind, um, other models of democracy, democratic socialism, um, big state democracies that, provide more resources to their people. What would it be if we lived in a place that had free healthcare, free housing, the basics needs, how that model contributes. People think it undermines democracy, but it contributes to democracy if people have their basic needs met.
Mm-hmm. If you were to look at the documentary, what were 2 things that gave you pause and really impacted your spirit?
I think all of the images from January 6th. every time I see even just a snippet of it, I think about the fear that must have been, pulsating in that chamber. The images of people hiding under desks on the floor of the Congress, the idea of people barricading themselves in their offices. I was a young professional on September 11th in Washington, D.C., and I remember what it felt like to be at work that day, and there's so much chaos and there's so much confusion, and wondering, is this my last day on earth? And for the number of people who died at work, I've always been struck by what that must have felt like to not be surrounded by family and friends, but be surrounded by your coworkers, to be at your place of work. And what does it mean to carry that? And for the people who were there that day, the incredible fear they must have faced, and, the frantic phone calls to loved ones, anyone who's recounting that experience, it doesn't leave you. And, I had some meetings scheduled with two Hill staffers on January 7th. And I said, if you want to cancel, we don't have to talk. And they said, no, we want to still have this meeting. And I said, what you just experienced is nothing small. What you're doing is so important. And, I was really touched by their commitment to say, we believe in what we're doing, and no amount of fear is going to stop that. And I was so moved by, about their position.
Mm-hmm. In looking at those same images, right? I think that I would like to have a pictorial that's distributed across the country, and every household should have it. Um, for those who don't really see the strength or the power in what happened, and and that we were just fortunate that they were thwarted when they were, right? That more didn't occur that could have been a lot worse, as you mentioned, right? How how do we share that with the children as an educator? How do you talk about that in a classroom setting?
I think you are honest. You say, as an educator, I want to keep you safe and I want to protect you. And the reality is that sometimes there are harms that are just in the outside world. And I want to talk to you about, a moment where people felt scared. I think sometimes we don't want to talk to students about, politics and things that are hard, but they're living in it. There isn't a single student, even if you don't want to talk about it, who didn't see those images from January 6th when they got home. And you say, when you see that, what does that make you feel? Like, does it make you feel afraid? Does it make you feel anxious? We talk about the feelings of the moment and we say, well, this is why this is such an important moment. This is why we need to learn about these things. What would you do if you knew someone who said that they thought that was good? How would you talk to them about that? We have to learn the communication skills around the entire event, not just do you have an opinion about this, but what are you noticing and perceiving about this event?
Mhm. And that's a powerful statement. Over here, we were just in shock. And how do you deal with the young people and tell them, try to explain to them was a very difficult thing for a lot of my friends as well to be able to express. Um, we're about to wrap up, but I would love for you to share with us uh, a summary of what we saw in this documentary and three things that you would like if you were creating your own documentary around this topic.
So tell me the first question again.
Just your opinion, just an overview, overarching of the documentary itself, an overarching view. And then what would you add or detract or take away if you were doing your own documentary about this topic?
Yeah, so for viewers who haven't seen it yet, this is a great, look at the various ways that American democracy has been tested in the past. January 6th is not an anomaly. It is a moment, like many moments in American history, where the tensions of the day explode and the target becomes the ultimate symbol of democracy. Elections matter, rhetoric matters, and I think that is always key. If I were to write my own documentary treatment, I think I would really focus on the people that we often don't think about as contributing and their contribution. So children contribute to this process. People who have not secured voting rights or have lost voting rights, they are part of the process as well. I think that it's important to highlight the importance of voting, but I don't want us to think that voting is the only place in which people express their commitment to this democracy or improve it. And so I'd want to think about unconventional ways of thinking about the democratic process.
Mm-hmm. And that's huge, right? That's huge. So, any last words that you would like to give our audience from your perspective? One, let's talk about how they can get your books, right?
Wherever books are sold, you can get my books, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, and Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration. The only thing I would say is just that no one is too young to get engaged in a conversation about being accountable, being responsible, being thoughtful to the people around them. So this is a conversation for people of all ages. You may not want to expose younger kids to the scenes of violence, but you want to talk to younger kids about how they express themselves when they feel like things are unfair. How do they welcome people who are different? There are all sorts of ways every day that we can prevent this from happening again. And it starts with creating a world that normalizes kindness and caring and doesn't, move in the direction of extremists who try to blame other people for their suffering, but rather tries to think about ways to alleviate all of our suffering.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Marcia Chatelain, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. We
My pleasure.
appreciate your input and congratulations for being a contributor to preserving democracy, pursuing a more perfect union. I'm really grateful that you took the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much. You take care.
Okay, thank you. I'm Marcia Jews with We Keep It Moving with Marcia Jews in STEM City. Please stay tuned and you'll learn more about how to get in touch with us. Take care. Thank you. Bye.
Nice meeting you.
It's wonderful meeting you. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
And we'll be in touch. Bye bye.